even though you seem to say that there was nothing much in your youth in terms of active participation, but more form of passive political participation in campus spaces, both in GNU and LSR. So we just wanted casually to ask you, when did you feel like becoming more active in politics? Was it when you became professor? Was it something you had in mind before? And if yes, what were the kind of sociality that was important in developing your critical eye on Indian society?
Yeah, so as a student, I was not an activist in the way in which I see my students are active at all. I was a feminist. I was a feminist as a teenager, and so I had a political perspective on the world and on India, but I was not active in organizing things, but I was available for mobilizing by left and feminist movements. So for example, when I was a student in LSR, I was president of the Students' Union in LSR, but at that time LSR Students' Union was more like an event organizing body. It was not political at all. Although individually we may have had political perspectives. But while I was a student, there was a protest that was organized against a beauty contest in Delhi University called Miss Delhi University, and there was a protest against that, and students from LSR went, and I went for that. I remember that as being probably one of my first public political activities. And then I came to JNU, and I was not in hostel in JNU. And in those days again, that meant that you were really out of everything that happened in JNU in a sense. So I would come for classes and go back. So again, I was not politically active in that sense, but I was left, I voted left, I participated in in campus political events, but I was one of the mobilized. I was there for the left. We had, so some of us set up a feminist reading group. We brought out a couple of PaRChAs or leaflets on issues to do with feminism at that time. So this is in the 80s, so I don't even remember what the issues were, but it was probably, sexism, patriarchy, something. So we did do that. So that was pretty much the extent of my political activism then. And then I started teaching in 1987, and teaching sharpened my political senses in a sense, because what I found was that when you adopt a certain perspective when teaching, there is a way in which that perspective challenges you to do more, or at least I found that was what was happening with myself, that I'm speaking to students, I'm giving them a Marxist, feminist perspective while teaching them the standard syllabus, which was not particularly Marxist or feminist, but I'm teaching the syllabus, but I have this perspective, and somewhere along the way I began to feel the need to be more active, but my first actual political activism happened in 1992, so it was as late as that. I think I would say that I became active with the demolition of the Babri Masjid, maybe for a year before that. So for about a year or two before that, I became part of this loose group called the Sampradayikta Virodhi Andolan, and that means movement against communalism. It was set up by people like Dilip Simyan and others. And so this Sampradayikta Virodhi Andolan was engaging with the growing Hindutva politics, which was becoming evident in the 90s. And then, so we would meet, we would write leaflets, we would hold small meetings, and then the masjid was demolished. And once that happened, I think from that point on, I and many others have been active in ways that we didn't actually see ourselves as being, in the sense that we were on the roads, we were holding protests, we were holding demonstrations, we were going to street corners, we were writing, we were speaking, all of that. So there was the Babri Masjid. So it's really well after my student days that I became politically involved.
It's quite interesting because you tell me whether it is accurate or not, but a huge community of professors in GNU and other universities have derived their political activism from the student days. A lot of accounts of I was active in campus who felt natural to be a teacher activist when I either came back to GNU as a professor or when I joined this or that college. Do you think that the space of campus as a public sphere, in addition to your, as you say, your critical eye that you develop while teaching, were instrumental in making you active in '92 and from '92 onwards?
The reason I would say no is because at that time I was teaching in Lady Shri Ram College, which was not a politically very lively place, in the sense that students were very receptive to politics, they were open to these ideas, but it was not a place like, let's say, JNU campus or even Miranda House in Delhi University, has always been a much more politicized space. Lady Shri Ram College is not on campus, it's off campus, it has a very different institutional feel. So for me it wasn't that. I can see how that might be the case, and I would certainly say that by now there is a way in which campuses have emerged as the center of all kinds of radical politics, against neoliberalism, against everything, communalism, casteism. So there's a way in which in the last couple of decades this has happened, and this has happened, I think, because of the expansion of access to education, partly through the big push in the OBC reservations, which also expanded general seats, and I think, but there was already an expansion because education is a very highly valued good in India. Even the poorest people will try and make sure their children are educated, and in India, as you know, until now, that's going to end very soon, but it's a public good. It's subsidized, heavily subsidized by the state, so that even if students don't have access to good schools in their childhood, if they can make it to higher education, then their studies are practically they're very affordable, practically free, and that's a very good thing. So there has been a general expansion and then an intensified expansion, and I think there has been that has been the catalyst for the politicization of campuses in the good sense, politicization in the sense of a recognition of how power works. So I think that this has happened in the last 2 decades, and I think many of us do recognize on this campus and in other campuses that the students push the agenda now, really, in ways that are astonishing and inspiring for us. But I wouldn't say that was the case in the 90s. In fact, that's what's interesting, because in the late 90s and even maybe the early, let's say 92 onwards, late 90s, there was always a sense that it's the same people at demonstrations and so on, that kind of a thing. Oh, it's the same lot and what's happening. But suddenly in the decades of this century, the 2 decades practically of the century, there has been a complete shift. I mean, people with grey hair are in the minority. It's young people who are pushing every issue, whether it was sexual violence in 2012 or it's huge movements against caste all over the country, against sexual harassment in campus after campus. So there's been that kind of transformation now. I think I was the tail end of an older kind of.
I see. And the kind of activism you have led since the 1990s, and it's not always on the question of nationalism, but on communalism, but also on the question, various range of questions regarding gender. Could you tell us a little bit more how active you have been on that front, and how concretely you see that kind of activism as connection with your body of work?
So I would say that I have been part of a very strong, visible movement on gender issues, which we used to call the women's movement, or women's movements, but I think many of us would prefer to call them queer feminist movements now, because it's not only women and it's not only women's issues. So there's been that kind of a shift in our own self-understanding of how we talk about gender and how we do gender. So that has been actually much more closely organically tied to my academic work as well, in the sense that my academic agenda has often been shaped by issues that I have been involved in as part of. So I've been part of something much larger than myself, and it's a very large, even in Delhi alone, it's a very large heterogeneous community. It's different intersecting circles, and so I guess my research interests have in many ways been shaped by doing the politics, and also by facing the kind of paradoxes that feminist politics entails. I mean, for example, when we campaign against sex determination, you're faced with the paradox of defending the right to abortion while trying to talk about sex-selective abortion. And the fine-tuning of that discourse, which happened in the movement, it reflected in the ways in which I theorized it. So it's, for me, my feminist perspective is very closely, organically bound to a movement, and the movement shapes my research, and I try to bring the research back to the movement, and so on. So that's a very organic link.
How important is the space of campus in helping shaping this perspective you have?
No, the campus is. I'm trying to think of a word which would actually express how significant. Significant is a small word. I mean, being inside a space in which our job is to be critical thinkers. I've always felt it to be a privilege and such a fortunate circumstance that it always felt like I was being paid to do what I enjoy doing. And I feel very sad speaking about it now like this, because it's very evident that given the way this regime is going, all this may be something we'll talk about as history and something in the past, but at least up to this point. So it's a space in which there are younger people constantly pushing your sense of whatever you think your politics is. So as a feminist, I know that I have traveled a long way from the time I was even in my 30s in my understanding of sexuality, sexual harassment, all of this. And there has not been, I think, although younger people might or might not agree, but I don't think there has been that kind of a hierarchy in the feminist movement, so that at meetings you would have very much young, and then at a meeting they're not students and teachers and doctors, we're all just feminists and we're all arguing things out. So whether it's the Uniform Civil Code or sexuality or whatever it is, I think these conversations, so the campus has always been one, I mean, I talked about overlapping spaces where one's politics develops, and the campus has always been one of those, I mean, one of the spaces that has been crucial, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom, as well as in terms of the discussions that students have among themselves, or when you're faced with, for example, many of us as faculty who are seen as feminist, we are faced with situations in which students need our help with reference to sexual harassment, or so then it doesn't remain theoretical ever for us. It has to be, we have to dirty our hands in practice, and then when we dirty our hands in practice, often you realize how some of your theoretical positions needed to be possibly shifted, or so it's a very live space of introspection and change and challenge, and it's not, I mean, I don't want it to sound like it's all very touchy-feely and we all love one another, because obviously there are a lot of bitter debates within the women's movement or the queer feminist movement, and there have been attacks, and one always hopes that those confrontations lead to some new position. So I won't say forward or backward, because I don't want to use that kind of linear narrative, but so that something new and productive comes out of these debates and arguments and disagreements, some of which can be very bitter.
I think we all have in mind cases of bitter debates, for the good and for the not good.
It's very interesting that you talk about the significance and how special the space of campus is, and since you also talk about sexual harassment, there's one, and of course helping students and all of that, but from within the feminist movement there has also been this push of looking at the campus as also a workplace, which has been, there has been a strategic argument also to look at campus spaces as any other workplace, of course special, but how as a teacher, activist, have you felt this sort of contradictory pushes in terms of preserving a special space and also looking at it as any other workplace to ensure women's rights?
That's interesting, but I don't see it as a contradictory thing at all, because the idea of saying it's a special place was never to romanticize it as a place of equality and justice. I was not actually part of the push to name the campus a workplace so that it could be so that the Visakhapatnam guidelines could apply. In fact, there were other amazing friends and fellow feminists, Delhi University, JNU, who worked at it. You know, Janaki Abraham, Pratiksha Bakshi in Delhi University, Janilo Kanita in JNU, Aisha, Anya Lumba, Aisha Kidwai, and many others. I mean, if I could name many others. So, insofar as the setting up of the committees and so on were concerned, I was part of the larger group. The really innovative, creative decision to treat the campus as a workplace was actually something that I benefited from. I didn't contribute to it. But I think it's very exciting, and I think I don't actually see a contradiction between the two at all, because there's nothing that says that in an ideal world a workplace can't be a space of joy and fulfillment and so on. So there need not be a contradiction, and in fact it was very crucial that shift that group of that kind of intervention managed was phenomenal, because the sexual harassment policies that then resulted came out of actually massive movements. In Delhi University, there were meetings in every college, there were meetings among students, etc. JNU, a similar process was followed, and really fine-tuned discussions on how should the different components be incorporated into the sexual harassment committee. Should it be election? Will election lead to a replication of the patriarchal, sexist overall atmosphere? And in fact, there were young men who campaigned, students, that we will make sure GS Cash is not anti-men. Those kind of campaigns were also there. So should it, but nomination has its own issues. So I remember in Delhi University, a really complicated, very fine-tuned strategy was evolved, whereby there were elected members and nominated members, and then the elected members nominated them. I mean, it was really complicated. What I'm trying to say is that that complication is very political, it's not bureaucratic. It sounds like a bureaucratic distinction between elected and nominated, but it was not. It was very much a political understanding, and campus as workplace has been really quite defining. Of course, with the new sexual harassment law, there has been an attempt to, and they have succeeded in JNU in shutting down the Vishaka Guidelines Committee, and in, I think, in Delhi University. But I know that JNU actually made our committee compliant with the law, so there was no need to shut this down. It just needed a few tweaks. And so, for example, Ambedkar University Delhi has managed to retain its Vishaka committee because you can show it's compliant with the law. But here there was another agenda, as you know, in JNU. In JNU, the agenda is to actually obliterate every possible institution that has made this a uniquely democratic space. It is uniquely democratic among other university campuses because it was set up as such by the JNU Act, and the JNU Act envisaged participation by students. So the students who are students are members of the Board of Studies, students are members of the Academic Council, the elected students, the Students' Union, or the councillors of the school. So there's a uniquely democratic space. The elections are conducted by the students. The one campus where there's never been any political violence until last year when the ABVP conducted the violence, and so on. So, so the GS Cash and the campus as workplace and so on has been really very, it's been in a very, it's been a kind of dialectic between the two rather than a contradiction.
It's interesting that you're bringing up the case of the Vishaka guidelines, because it seems to me that both enable, of course, a law to enter campus spaces, but also the students to students and the teaching community, to the administration, to collaborate in few spaces in HCU, in GNU, in DU, to kind of think about how to implement a more gender equal campus. Did you, even though you were in DU at the time, in 96, 97?
In 96, 97 I was teaching at Lady Shri Ram College. In 2002 I went to Delhi University Department, and I came here in 2008.
Was it that moment really important for you to witness how spaces like campus could appropriate those Vishaka guidelines, politicize on this agenda, and kind of supplement them with questions that became more and more important in the later years, such as sensitization, such as queer issues, with elections associated to those, to for instance, GS Cash elections. So do you see that as a turning point?
Do I see my going to Delhi University as a turning point?
The implementation of the Vishaka guidelines and how they became a political object for
I don't see it as a turning point. It's a landmark in the journey, but it's not been a turning point in any sense. I'm not quite sure what you mean by turning point, but what I would say is that it was a landmark because through that a whole lot of other issues emerge. Participating in that, participating in some committees, sitting on some sexual harassment committees, and realizing how difficult it is to establish, one or the other, and how does one do that. There was a particular case against a professor in Delhi University, which I was part of the campaign against that particular case as well. So it's been one of the very important landmarks. And you mentioned queer politics, but my understanding of queer politics was shaped much before the Vishaka guidelines. I mean, that came out of my feminism. And so I mean, the first piece I wrote on queer politics was an article in the late 90s. So that came out of my feminist politics. But I do take, and I think any feminist in India would take the Vishaka guidelines as a remarkable moment because it named, and that also tells us something about how feminist politics work.
This triggers many questions in my head. But one of them is, do you think that the GS cash which emerged after the implementation?
I think it has been successful in generating a perspective, but it obviously hasn't ended sexual harassment. But at least it has created a situation in which sexual harassment is seen as an issue. And of course, so it was an important moment, and we were able to name it as something. I think that is we were able to name the problem as something that exists. And there have been, if you speak to people who have actually been active inside GS Cash in JNU or the Sexual Harassment Committee of Delhi University, the Apex Committee, I think you'll find that if you look at the kind of fine-tuned ways in which they had to deal with cases, because there are mostly it's peer-to-peer cases. Very rarely do students actually have the courage to bring a case against a professor. When that happens, how does one follow it up? So I have followed up one such case in Delhi University. Yes, it does politicize the students. Now, for example, when GS Cash was closed down here, the students still held the GS Cash election. It was another festival on JNU. It was a GS Cash that they elected, which had absolutely no standing as far as the administration was concerned, and yet they came out and they voted in large numbers, and the atmosphere was exactly like any JNU election with songs and slogans, and men and women all out in large numbers voting for candidates who would actually not have any power, but it was a powerful symbolic assertion of what GS Cash stood for. So there's been a huge transformation from the time when GS Cash began, where it was suspiciously looked on by most people as something that would just get men into trouble, and the gradual way in which a kind of feminism has become commonplace, such that the large majority of JNU students today want GS Cash back. That's what those elections showed, that symbolic election showed. I mean, because of students, there are some issues that we can't go back on. There's no going back. You can't go back on something like sexual harassment anymore, because they're there. They're going to question us. They're going to charge us with, what are you doing?
It's fascinating. The exhibition will try to look a little bit on question of intersectionality. The way we design it, we have like 7 themes, and of course there's a question of gender, but there are also 2 other themes that solidify in the same kind of period liberalization and Indo-nationalism. You were mentioning Babri Masjid.
Sorry, what was the second one?
The Indo-nationalism. And of course, Babri Masjid demolition. So, did your understanding of gender politics from the point of view of campus, was it informed, or did you take a new course in the moving landscape of the 90s with Hindutva becoming extremely prominent even in campus spaces? Like in GNU, for instance, in the mid-90s to the early 2000s, the BBP was an extremely strong force in campus. And of course, liberalization, which started in the early 90s. Did your understanding of gender and gender politics change at this time, considering these new forces getting to the fore?
I wouldn't say my understanding of gender politics changed, but what I want to bring in is a factor that you haven't mentioned, which is that in North India, and in North Indian feminists based in North India like myself, the understanding that we came to very late was that of caste. It was caste that we did not understand and did not take seriously as a factor. It emerged into mainstream Indian feminism very slowly, whereas feminists based in the South were much more alert because there were much more very visible caste movements, especially Dalit movements in the South. So the question of caste is something that I would say I came to I could say surprisingly late, but it's not surprisingly late given my caste class location. It's revealing of the fact that my kind of caste class location can generate, however progressive you might think yourself to be and however feminist and so on, it can generate a blindness towards caste from this space. So I think my first, actually the first point at which caste enters educational institutions as an issue is with the Mandal reservations in the 90s. So there were three elements to the 90s, right? So it was called, as you know, Mandal Mandir Masjid. So Mandal was the reservations, Mandal Mandir Market, Mandal Mandir Market. So it was privatization, what you're calling liberalization, I prefer to call marketization or privatization. And then you had the Mandir politics and then you had the Mandal politics. And what happened with the Mandal reservations and the ways in which it was opposed so strongly by upper caste students who used the language of equality and justice and to deny the need for reservations for OBCs. I think that was and I was teaching in LSR at that time, and that was when it hit me that I had not been at all alert to the way in which caste is rendered invisible in spaces like LSR. So LSR students who would never step out, as I said, it was not a very politicized space at all, and yet they were willing to go out and march on the streets against Mandal. Even the faculty was encouraging them to do that, and so on. And they were it seems, expected teachers like us to support them, because this is about going out and protesting a government policy. And they were very surprised when we were literally developing an understanding on our feet. So they were surprised that we didn't support the protests against Mandal, and I was surprised that it was like a whole world opened up to me. So I'm aware that I edited a book called Gender and Politics in India in the 90s, which it was framed as debates in the women's movement, and there is nothing on caste. I did not think there was a single debate on caste. I didn't exclude caste. I didn't think about caste. So there is a way in which caste enters our lexicon and our understanding, and it transforms us because of the very powerful Dalit voices that became more and more impossible to not hear. So I'm very aware of the fact that, but once it happens, there's no going back. So I do, and campuses are very important spaces for this, and there is a critique made of the left that, and probably rightly, that the left is, and I guess I should include myself, is blind to the way in which caste operates. But I think there are at least, I mean, there are many of us on the left now who recognize that there's a journey that we have made. And I think among students also that is very evident, that now one has to, it may not, the caste may not be always recognized in the ways in which everybody accepts, and so there would still be charges of co-opting the caste question, or there's still issues where students have challenged, can challenge people for, say, quoting Ambedkar or teaching Ambedkar and saying you're co-opting him, and why should a Savarna person speak about Ambedkar? These things also happen, and I treat it as part of the ways in which campuses are prickly places. You know, so it's not a romantic, sweet place where we love each other. It's a prickly place, and it's a place that produces blood among one another, and it's good blood, bloodletting in the old sense.
But then there are also these special circumstances which actually do bring people together, which is something that happened in 2016. That unprecedented kind of solidarity is emerging because everybody perceived of what is happening as a challenge against the prickly space that
No,
it is.
you know, but what I feel is that was very momentary, and because that kind of extraordinary moment can paper over very real differences, but then what happens is that once that extraordinary moment passes, then, and that passes fairly rapidly, then the real issues still remain. So as you know, that solidarity broke down over the course of 1 year very quickly, and I wouldn't say, so I don't want to say that there should be solidarity at all costs, but how to build solidarity becomes the question, with trust and so on, and so it's an issue still. I think those kinds, that was very momentary, because that involves a papering over, then the paper cracks. So.
But it also brought a lot of innovation in terms of, for example, the symbolic value that you were talking about in context of GS Cash elections after GS Cash was practically disbanded.
Not practically, it was disbanded. They put a big lock on the door and shut it up. Yeah.
Sealing and all of that. But also the nation needs to know classrooms that happened at that time. That was also something which was quite an innovative way of.
Yes.
And then of course it led to a chain of events.
No, it was those lectures. Again, if you think about that moment, because it was actually our friend and colleague Janki Nair who said, look, if our students are being arrested for sedition, maybe we should talk about what nationalism really means. So she said, let's do a series of lectures. That's all. It was a very academic, a good, solid historian's response to this political attack, and it became an event of the sort that I don't think she thought it would become, and none of us thought it would become. So yes, those series of lectures, and it would not be possible without the ways in which students enabled it, and the way in which they welcomed it, and the kind of audiences and so on. So yes, it was, if you think about it, it wasn't so innovative. It was a bunch of teachers teaching after hours. We took our classes and then we went and took another lecture. And it's a kind of thing we do routinely. And as you know, in JNU campus, there are talks and lectures all the time. So I could well teach a class in the morning and then go do a lecture for some, for some group. Do you want me to stop? Sorry.
No, I wanted to ask a question. Did you plan on occupying the admin block?
For the lectures?
Yeah.
So,
like, was Was it also inspired by like Occupy Wall Street?
No. It was a completely public space. From the 1970s, that's the place we go. That's the place we go to protest because that's where the administration is. So we, meaning students, mostly in JNU, teachers haven't had to protest in the kinds of ways that we're having to protest now. But it was just a space where we routinely went. So it was so we meet at ad block, such and such event, ad block. So this was organized there because it's the largest space where you can actually have so we didn't. It wasn't an Occupy. It was a lecture series. Now it's another matter that the administration has now they went to the court and they got an order issued by the court, because courts also don't, the very unique character of JNU is not something that one can always explain to courts. So courts were simply told that they're blocking us from fulfilling our administrative functions, which was nonsense. And so the court issued an order that no protest can be held within 100 meters of any administrative complex, but that referred only to students. This administration has used it to try and stop teachers as well, and it's all very complicated. But what I'm trying to say is that this was the kind of campus where we did that routinely. So it was not meant to be an Occupy, it was meant to be a lecture series, and it was a lecture series. In retrospect, when you ban it from us, it looks like, oh my God, did those guys go and capture that space? No, we just held a lecture and the students came, and so it got filled up. It's a very characteristic, typical JNU thing. JNU had, for example, a very powerful tradition of 9 p.m. lectures after dinner in the different hostel messes. And people would have their dinner and just land up. Hundreds of students would land up to listen to people from all over the country who would be invited, people from all over the city. There would be talks on caste and gender and whatever issue was going on by academics, by trade unionists, and the messes were full. Today, because every single hostel warden has pretty much been appointed by this new administration following certain principles of compliance to them, students hardly ever get permission to hold those talks anymore. So now if a talk is held in a mess, you might say, oh wow, did you take a serious decision to break a rule? What I'm trying to say is that an ordinarily democratic culture of this university has been criminalized by this administration. There is no doubt in all our minds that this is not this particular administration, it's a bigger agenda, and the RSS is involved. So the ABVP, as you know, is not the students' wing of the BJP, it's the students' wing of the RSS. It owes its allegiance straight to Nagpur, where the headquarters of the RSS is. And in JNU, we've always followed the principle as faculty of not distinguishing between students. And I'm all closer to some student organization or the other, but I didn't think of the ABVP as any it's an student organization, students do their thing. But we are realizing that the ABVP acts as stormtroopers for the fascist regime, and it's ABVP students who have been at the head of filing police complaints against me, against many other, and not just in Delhi but all over the country, against faculty members. So there's a way in which this very lively space has become full of pitfalls because rules have been changed, administrative staff have been changed, people who control administration. We had principles of seniority, rotation by seniority, those have been broken. So we're essentially living in a police version of what JNU was. It's like a kind of police state. I shouldn't say that because I'll know when they really establish a police state, which is also not impossible. But it is almost like a police state. There's almost everything that students want to do is now. They've removed all the posters from the walls. I don't know if you followed that. So there was just phenomenal artwork. You can still see some of it. There was a huge painting of Che over there. There's still some spaces where the posters have remained, only because they're very difficult to unpeel from these bricks, I realized. So I presume underpaid contract labor is standing, you can see them standing on ladders and having to peel it off square by square. So it's a big job. And so they've not fully succeeded in removing them. So you remove posters, and then when the Students' Union held a drive to put posters back, the Students' Union president was charged. So every single ordinary action on this campus has been criminalized. They're so petty, this administration, and so terrified of students, that it was like the Home Minister was contesting the JNUSU elections this time. Because when JNUSU elections were held, they tried to hold it up and they tried to sabotage it in every possible way, the administration, along with ABVP. They tried to sabotage it in every possible way. They had to go to, they went to court, they tried to get a stay, but the court forced the declaration, and it's been a sweep for the left, right? So what is that? That's when you begin to think you're important, you know. We were just a small university, and you think that really the regime is so scared of Students' Union elections in a university with 8,000, 9,000 students. What are they scared of?
We had a discussion yesterday on this line, and we were wondering whether GNU was before a space of self-transformation in which people come and become politicized, to a place where people self-select themselves into a political space, because GNU has become such an institution.
I think there is an element of that. Yes, we talk about that among ourselves also, that I think there is an element of that, because you find students saying, one of our colleagues was saying the other day that there are women students who say to her that my mother said you can't go study in JNU, and she said I will go and study in JNU, and she came from some not a very, I mean it's kind of a semi-urban part of Haryana, and she fought with her family to come to JNU because it has been produced as this space. But I wouldn't say it's a transformation. I think both these elements still exist. I mean, the element of self-transformation still exists, and the element of self-transformation is actually something that is common across campuses in India, because the Indian family structure is so restrictive that when they come away from their family into these spaces and they listen to the voices of their peers, there's a way in which they do become politicized. So it's not only JNU. If you look at, there's actually a very interesting film by someone on student movements in India, which was made a year or so ago by a person who's in the NSUI. So that shows a woman young woman saying that in a campus in probably BHU or one of Allahabad University, one of the North Indian campuses. And she says, you know, when I was with my family, then it's like my family's friends and my parents' friends' children and all that. And then I came to the university and I had my own social circle and we were discussing all kinds of things. So it's like my own social circle, you see. And these are, and because education is not impossibly unaffordable in India, these are not necessarily children from elite families. They're young people from lower middle class families, sometimes from working class families. And I think the students are also feeding off a certain kind of filtering across the fabric, social fabric of movement politics, whether it's feminist movement or left movement or workers' movements or anti-communal movements and so on. That politics is actually very capillary in India. The party system seems to have collapsed as far as I can see. I don't think we can expect anything from the parties. I don't know what kind of transformation would be required, but it's like there's a real disjuncture between democratic politics in India and party politics. So if you look at the ways in which, for example, Not in My Name, if you saw the Not in My Name mobilization, it was not one centralized call, it was two people saying on Facebook, Sabha and Rahul said on Facebook, let's do it, and then everyone just owns it and takes it on, or like the protests about the gang rape in 2013, or the way an organization like, it's not even an organization, a movement like Pijra Tod works. It works in these, so I think that there's a way in which that kind of political understanding has filtered, and it's not someone teaching you in class left politics, or it's not teachers holding something. there's a sense of a minimum democratic expectation among young people now. It did not translate into votes, and I have my own reasons to think that this was not a fair election. I don't think that the sweeping victory reflects the actual voting of the people. So this self-transformation still happens, but for JNU we have been feeling that it is possible that there is a kind of defiant way in which people say, oh, is that it? That's where I want to go. We think that may also be happening.
What will be the mechanism, the process, social interaction, political socialization? Do you think it's mostly related to a form of generational turn with professors who are not discouraging political activities? Is it a form of self-selection? How would you...
See, I would say that in terms of faculty, if you look at the academic faculty across the country, because we're now talking across the country, but even in JNU, it's not like the majority are leftist and feminist. For the majority, it's a job. And so I'm not sure to what extent professors can be considered responsible or be treated as elements in the transformation, political transformation of people. Obviously, there's a transformation in terms of, hopefully, of intellectually, academically, etc. But we all, many of us who are left and so on, we write, and that writing circulates and so on. So I would put professors last in this list of elements that go into self-transformation. I think the important element is peer-to-peer. The ways in which students interact among one another, argue with one another. There are arguments that they can have access to, as I said, because of the ways in which movements have produced a certain filtering down, up, sideways of certain perspectives on the environment, on Hindutva, on labor, on, and so on. So I think there is that filtering, and then when students enter university spaces, they get what that young woman called their own social circles. And I think the self-transformation happens through peer-to-peer interaction the most. Yeah, I would say that. And I think the more they're able to move away from the orbit of their family, the more the transformation. As long as they remain within the orbit of their family, so if they are living away from their families, the chances of their being able to do a number of things, stay back late for meetings, especially women, and so on, without having to explain every single day why I'm only coming home at 5 when my class ended at 2. That sort of escape from the family, so the sheer expansion of the education. So it's not surprising that this regime is intent on restricting education again, making it expensive, restricting it, making it accessible to fewer people, because it's not the formal education that is doing all that much. It may be, but it's what's happening outside classrooms, what's happening when they meet at dinner, what's happening when they chat under a tree, when they attend a meeting,
At the beginning of the interview, you were mentioning those overlapping spaces that enable gender politics and other form of politicization. Campus is one of them. Then what are the other spaces that you are in?
Other spaces would be my professional space of other teachers, other academics, because we're also in unions. We have teachers' unions, which are very active and very clear on our perspective. So whether it was DUTA, Delhi University Teachers Association, or JNUTA. So there is the political space of the teaching community. There is the space of academic intellectual interaction with colleagues and friends across institutions in the country. So there's that kind of, those kinds of discussions, seminars, conversations, etc. There's the space of feminist and feminist groups, interaction, meetings, discussions over specifically feminist issues, and in all these overlapping circles there are also very close friendships. So it's not just with colleagues, but they're very close friendships and they're close communities that have developed. Then there's actually another space which in the 90s was very strong, and there was a phase, I think, and then till the early 21st century, which is just the spaces in which democratic groups and individuals came together over issues, so issue based. So when the Babri Masjid was demolished, there was something we formed called People's Movement for Secularism. And People's Movement for Secularism was a bunch of people, which included Sampradayikta Virodhi Andolan, but it included trade unions, so extreme left trade unions, let's say, to Gandhians, and Dalit groups and so on, women's groups. So we would, so those were interesting and important spaces of intervention, political intervention. There was People's Movement for Secularism, there was a movement against nuclear energy, Parmani Bam Virodhi Andolan, the movement against the nuclear bomb. There was a movement, there was a campaign against the closure of factories in Delhi, Delhi Janwadi Adhikar Manch, which tried to fight against the counterposition of workers' rights to middle class rights to the environment. So these were, and so these were some, then after Gujarat there was Aman Ekta Manch, after Gujarat 2002. But after that, that phase, that has not happened so much anymore. There was a phase it happened. So that was another set of people with whom one would not, so they're not academics, they're not, some of them are, but one met people and one got involved in discussions with people who one met in those spaces. So that was another kind of space of, let's say, voluntary political activism.
The exhibition is going to be very much focused on pamphlets as a political object and as a tool of socialization, and also as an object that enables solidarity within political organization, but also teaching group and student group. How would you see in your experience the importance of pamphlets, both in creating conflict, arguments in a democratic way, and in accessing the other and building a form of political interaction?
See, I think when you ask me this in 2019, we have to remember that most people are on their phones now. So I do wonder at how much purchase an actual paper pamphlet has anymore. I do wonder about that. But if we can use it in a broader sense, the word pamphlet, in a broader sense as a statement in writing of opposition, which could circulate by WhatsApp or Facebook as well, if we can broaden pamphlet to include that. Because when we made the pamphlets, I'm talking about the feminist group, we cyclo-styled them, right? I mean, yeah, I think it was in Katwaria Sarai, we got them cyclo-styled. So then of course it became easier and easier to make pamphlets, but now, so let's treat the word pamphlet as standing for words, a very clear statement which you formulate with so it could be a statement on Kashmir, for example. It could be a statement on anything, or it could be a group saying this is what we feel about X issue. So if you're going to use pamphlet to mean that, I think it has still enormous power, regardless of the fact that the large masses of the country are not reading pamphlets. They're watching a highly controlled media and a highly bought over media, a very, very restricted media. So that's actually really problematic and dangerous. Nevertheless, I think the written word has an impact, and I think those who can read do read, and they do. And the way we argue over the smallest words in joint statements, I don't think that's a waste of time. I don't think we're talking to a very small group. So I think as an artifact, a set of written words still has enormous power within restricted circles, and but those circles are not minority circles. I mean, they're not circles which are uninfluential. The entire, for example, student body of the country, as I'm saying, they're the ones who are really saying the most radical things. They're reading. So I think it continues to have, yeah, a lot of meaning.
There's this argument that the pamphleteer, pamphlet as an object, encapsulate this pamphleteer narrative, which is first a call for action. What are you doing? Wake up! And a certain form of moralistic discussion, like what is right and what is wrong. Did you feel that it was an appropriate mode of political action back in the 90s or the 2000s or even now, when you shaped your queer and feminist politics?
So I always felt that there were two registers. If you're an academic and you're politically active, writing a pamphlet is not writing a paper or even a newspaper article. When you're writing a pamphlet, you have to adopt a more forceful style. So I remember when we were, for example, during the Babri Masjid days, when we were preparing material for our public campaigns, we followed the myth and fact format, that there's the Hindutva myth and this is a fact, this is the Hindutva myth and this is a fact, which I would never do. I would never counterpose myth and fact in any context whatsoever. I would have much more sophisticated ways of talking about why and how I make an ethical argument. But in the pamphlet I did, and we all did, and we laughed because most of us were academics, that this is not how we would do it. So, but I don't see it as false and true, that our true selves are the academics and this is a false self. I would see it as different registers. So if one wants to be, and we no longer have the luxury, if we ever did, of being academics and just reading and having academic debates. I don't think we ever did. But now increasingly more and more people would realize that they don't. Then we do learn to work in different registers, you know that the audience for an academic paper is different from an audience for a newspaper article. So in a newspaper article you might be willing to state something more in a more black and white way, which if you had the space and the time you might have expanded into 10 sentences because there's so many caveats to everything. And then you have the pamphlet mode. I don't write pamphlets anymore, but let's say a statement, if one were drafting a statement, but statements have to be very careful. Statements which are signed by hundreds of people those statements are not like pamphlets. Statements, so that's a third register. A statement on something against lynching or against the abrogation of Article 370. Such things would be, I think, still quite, they would have to be very finely tuned. And then finally you have the pamphlet form, or then you have a poster. So I think we learn to function in different registers, and the myth fact is not a bad register at all, because there's so many actual lies that are circulating that there's no harm, I think, in saying, well, look, we know this to be a fact. It's not true. X is not true. I think there are different registers of political activities.
I think it's really insightful. We had a question long ago, about Marxism, feminism, and how for certain professors and activists that emerged from the Marxist scholarship and also Marxist activism, from the SFI, from ISA, had for a very long time a certain form of reluctance, in particular in campus spaces and outside also, call themselves feminist because it was parasiting a little bit their Marxist credentials. And they could
That they
not-
were reluctant to call themselves feminists?
reluctant to call themselves feminists. Was it something you, in your personal activist journey you encounter people who had difficulties in adjusting their queer credential to their Marxist credos? Were there a lot of discussion regarding this
Oh,
within
yeah.
academic
Oh, yeah.
circle and
No, the Indian, what used to be the Indian women's movement was very, very much influenced, it was very powerfully dominated by women who were in left organizations, and in fact feminism emerged only from, we kind of recognize an autonomous feminism really emerging in the 90s in India, when women broke away from parties and set up groups which were meant to address feminist issues. So this is a part of our history. Personally, I began as a feminist and I entered Marxism as a feminist. So there was no point at which I felt I had to be awkward about my feminist positioning, because I was a feminist who was encountering Marxism. And so I was always very clear that, and there are many of us like that, who were very clear that Marxism needed to, so this was at the very early stage when you realize how gender blind Marxism is and what are the issues, and then you arrive at the whole range of scholarship in the West about feminists who call themselves Marxists who are being critical of Marxism. So, so this is very much the history in the history of the women's movement too in India. But so there's that phase when, you know, Marxism and Marxist feminists have to adapt to, and so the debates were about that, and there was that stage. Then there's a stage where again left feminists were very uncomfortable with, not left but party feminists were very uncomfortable with the idea of taking non-heteronormativity seriously. They did not see heteronormativity as normative, they saw it as natural, and so gradually at best they started thinking in terms of, okay, human rights of those people who are homosexuals. But then the queering of the movement happened gradually such that it's not any long, and all that happens because of intense conversations. You have to understand, we were having, like, we would land up in party offices and have 3-hour-long conversations. So the querying doesn't happen like that. I mean, for that matter, this judgment, the section, finally the when 377 was abolished by the Supreme Court, it's a product of 2 decades of a queer politics which involves just hundreds of people. So I see now that any young person coming into feminism today is already entering a queer feminism. And that has happened because of 2 decades of politics. So there is nobody who's calling themselves a feminist today who thinks that queer is nothing, or that's something else and I'm a no, it's not like that anymore. You enter a space which is already queer. Caste is still, I think, something and especially Dalit politics and Dalit identity, that conversation is still very difficult. It's complicated even within the feminist movement because most of the women who are seen as, one of the prominent, I was about to say, who are seen as prominent in the women's movement, but that so-called prominence is because also of a way in which media has developed. As I said, nobody knows the names of the people who worked on the Vishakha judgment, Vishakha guidelines. Today you will know every single thing about anybody who does anything because everybody's names are out there. So the prominence is not something any of us craved. It happened because of the form that the media takes. So because many of us are Savarna and non-Dalit, there is a sense, quite correctly, that the movement is not alert enough to. So I would say the sticking point is not so much queer politics anymore. The sticking point is caste.
And was this effort of introspection, this tremendous effort of reconsidering one's identity in order to see the fault lines and see what was before invisible, the caste mark and the caste structuring of campus, society. Was it enabled more by your teaching? Was it more enabled by the discussion that happened in campus spaces, or were they the product of the context, the Mandel earthquake?
No, I would say this overlapping circles. It's really, I would reiterate that it's not any one of these spaces. If I were not a teacher, I don't know how much of an activist I would be. Being a teacher is it places, I think, special responsibilities on one. One is forced to test one's theory against one's practice. One is pushed by the radicalism of one's students. They risk everything. It's amazing, and you think, this is the least I can do. So it's very crucial. I mean, I think I am very definitively shaped by the campus, because that is where I have been since 1987. It's more than 30 years, right? It has shaped me, different kinds of campuses, I mean, so because it's my work, so maybe I would say yes, overlapping circles, but because this is my work, and this is the work in which I am mainly, perhaps I could say that yes, the campus, being in the campus, being part of the campus, being part of changing campuses, being part of those projects of self-transformation in some way, I think those, yes, maybe that, I would say that is shaped me definitively and shaped my politics. You know, for instance, I want to give an example. I remember when the movement against corruption started, our students were talking about campaigns against corruption, and the Students' Union president was from my class, and he was telling me about the movement against corruption, and I literally was like, against corruption? Is that even a political issue? So I didn't get it, and then I got it. So it was being here and seeing how the idea of corruption had such a, and then I realized, of course, that it goes back to the RTI campaign and the right to work and all of that, and I could see the right to information, which turned out to be such a radical tool. So it came out of all of that, but the students were plugged into that and I wasn't. And I realized the radical potential of anti-corruption movements only because I was here. So, yeah, I guess I would say that the campus.
Sneha, do you have any? No? This is, I think, my last question regarding the particular location of campus feminism within the broader landscape of feminist and queer politics. And the kind of recurrent accusation is a really strong in India, I feel, to label this kind of feminism as elite and therefore unable to represent the larger bulk of citizens and individuals. And do you see that critique coming really often? How do you
Actually,
address
I'm
it?
hearing it for the first time from you. I don't think campus feminism, but there could be, and as I said, the Dalit critiques are about the elitism, caste and class elitism of mainstream feminism, of feminism which they consider to be mainstream feminism. So there's that kind of critique, but I don't think there's a specific critique of campus feminism as being elite. There is so there is that other caste class position that is invoked by Dalit critiques. But I haven't, and then there is the anti-feminist kind of critique, let's say from outside, by other,
Sharad Yadav.
Yeah, Sharad Yadav, or, yeah, I mean, other kinds of political forces which would say, oh, this is just Western and elite and so on. But that's from completely outside the feminist field, from within the feminist, and that's not directed at campus feminism as such. I don't think there's a concept of campus feminism. I don't think that such a differentiation is made.